We are currently witnessing one of those rare, agonizing moments in the grand sweep of global power where the veneer of invincibility begins to crack, not from a single catastrophic blow, but from the accumulation of unkind truths that can no longer be ignored. It is a phenomenon I have observed time and again in the annals of falling empires and overextended regimes. The transition from the comforting, state-mandated lie to the cold, undeniable reality of failure. For months, the narrative coming out of Moscow was one of calculated progress, a slow, grinding machine that would eventually wear down its neighbor through sheer mass. But as I survey the current landscape, it is clear that the machine is stuttering. The special military operation, once framed as a brief professional excursion, has mutated into a war for survival that is now spilling across borders the Kremlin swore were inviolable. This is the core thesis of our current era. The leverage has shifted, and the very actors who sought to dictate the terms of the New World Order are finding themselves paralyzed by the technical and psychological resilience of an opponent they deeply underestimated. To understand the gravity of this shift, one must look at the recent strikes deep within Russian territory, specifically the targeting of key energy infrastructure like the Ust-Luga and Tuapse terminals. These are not merely tactical successes for Ukraine. They are strategic humiliations for a superpower that prides itself on its defensive depth. Russia possesses only 4 major ports in its European territory. These are the arteries of its economy, the lifeblood of its ability to fund its ambitions. And yet, we see these facilities engulfed in flames, while the much-vaunted Russian air defense systems are conspicuously absent or repurposed to protect the elite enclaves of Moscow. This creates a devastating internal contradiction. When a state can no longer protect its economic centers, the social contract between the ruler and the ruled begins to dissolve. I see this as a classic historical pivot point. Just as the Tsarist regime found its legitimacy eroded when it could no longer guarantee the basic security of its borders or the functionality of its economy during the Great War, the modern Russian establishment is facing a crisis of competence that no amount of state-controlled media can fully mask. What makes this moment particularly unique is the way the international political wind is shifting, even among those who were previously eager to facilitate a Russian victory. Look at the recent evolution of Donald Trump's rhetoric. For a long time, the narrative was that a return of Trump to the White House would mean the immediate abandonment of Ukraine, a deal that would effectively hand victory to Putin on a silver platter. But even a transactional realist like Trump is starting to see the writing on the wall. He is a man who, above all else, wants to be on the side of a winner. As the strikes inside Russia intensify and the front lines refuse to collapse, the calculation is changing. If Zelensky can actually win, or at least prevent a Russian victory, the great deal Trump envisioned with Putin becomes a liability rather than an asset. This is the cold, cynical heart of geopolitics. There are no permanent allies, only permanent interests, and currently, the interest of the global power players is gravitating toward the side that demonstrates the most effective use of force. The Ukrainian perspective, as highlighted by those on the ground, has evolved from a desperate plea for help to a gritty, self-reliant defiance. They have realized that relying on the whims of Western political cycles, be it Trump's potential return or the bureaucratic lethargy of the European Union, is a fool's errand. Instead, they have taken the fight into the heart of the Russian economy. By striking Tuapse and Ust-Luga, Ukraine has signaled that it will no longer play the role of the passive victim confined to its own borders. This is a radical departure from the early days of the conflict. It is a message to the Russian oligarchs and the silent majority in Moscow. Your comfort is a fragile illusion. When Putin is forced to move air defense batteries from vital economic ports to protect the Kremlin skyscrapers, he is admitting that his resources are finite and his priorities are purely personal. This brings us to the internal Russian reaction, which is perhaps the most telling indicator of the regime's long-term instability. For 2 years, the Russian public has been fed a diet of kind lies, the assurance that everything is going according to plan, that the West is collapsing, and that the Russian soldier is an unstoppable force of nature. But the unkind truths are now being shouted by the very people who were supposed to be the regime's biggest cheerleaders. Consider the recent outbursts from Russian military bloggers and nationalist commentators. These are not liberal dissidents or Western agents. These are the men who want Russia to win at any cost, and yet their language has turned into one of pure, unadulterated rage. When you hear a prominent voice in the Russian military sphere screaming about the blanking disaster at Tuapse, calling the leadership out of touch with reality, and demanding that competent commanders take over from those who view soldiers as nothing more than fuel for a meat grinder, you are hearing the sound of a system in a state of nervous breakdown. These bloggers are pointing out the surreal disconnect between the official parades and the reality of the front. They see the country being hammered every single day, and they see a government that responds with silence or more empty promises. This internal friction is the most dangerous threat to any authoritarian structure. It isn't the external pressure of sanctions or foreign weapons that topples such regimes. It is the moment when the core supporters, the mill bloggers, the soldiers, the local authorities realize they are being sacrificed for a lie. The cynicism I see here is profound. The faith in the government is being systematically destroyed, not by Ukrainian propaganda, but by the undeniable evidence of Russian incompetence. The state tells them they are a superpower, but the burning horizon at their key ports tells them they are vulnerable. The state tells them the front is stable, but the return of body bags and the lack of military equipment at home tells them they are losing. This is the classic trap of the autocrat. Once you start believing your own kind lies, you lose the ability to correct the very errors that will eventually destroy you. The transition from everything is fine to the country is screwed can happen with terrifying speed, and looking at the vitriol currently being spewed by those who once championed this war, I suspect we are much closer to that tipping point than the world realizes. This realization is not restricted to the frontline trenches or the digital echo chambers of the ultra-nationalists. It has seeped into the sterile studios of Moscow's intellectual elite, where the discourse has taken an even more ominous turn. I find it fascinating to observe how, when direct criticism becomes a death sentence, the intellectual class retreats into the safety of historical analogy to signal their despair. Recent discussions among professional Russian commentators have begun to evoke the ghosts of 19th century South America to describe the current predicament in Eastern Europe. They speak of the War of the Triple Alliance, specifically framing it as a devastating struggle between Paraguay and its neighbors that left only a fraction of the male population alive, far below the level required for any meaningful population recovery. By invoking this particular historical tragedy, these analysts are admitting what the Kremlin's press office never will, that Russia is currently locked in a demographic death spiral. They see a deadlock where neither side can bring the other to its knees through conventional strikes. Yet the slaughter continues, fueled by interests that have nothing to do with the survival of the Russian or Ukrainian people. This brings us to a more sinister layer of the geopolitical mechanism, the role of the modern oligarchs and the global extraction interests. In these intellectual circles, the war is increasingly being compared to old colonial conflicts where scumbags in high offices and boardrooms fueled the fires of ethnic and national hatred to clear the land of its native inhabitants. They draw a chilling parallel between the banana and oil companies of the past and the industrial military interests of the present. The cynical view here is that this is not a war of liberation or defense, but a war of liquidation, a process of clearing the Slavic heartland of its youth so that the vast resources of the region can be more easily managed by the elite. It is a startling admission of systemic betrayal. When you hear Russian voices openly questioning how exactly they are going to continue fighting when they are moving toward a war of robots, where human life has become a redundant currency, you are witnessing the collapse of the great Russia myth. They are effectively saying that the people have been tricked into a meat grinder for the benefit of a few, while the very survival of their civilization is being gambled away on a stalemate. The physical evidence of this erosion is now visible in the very heart of the state's ceremonial power. Take, for example, the transformation of the May 9th Victory Day parades, a cornerstone of Russian national identity. In the past, these were displays of overwhelming technological might, a reminder to the world of the power that crushed the Third Reich. But now, the equipment is missing. When ordinary Russians are asked how they feel about the absence of tanks and armored vehicles, the responses are no longer unified by patriotic fervor. Some hide behind the kind lie, suggesting the equipment is simply needed elsewhere, or that it burns expensive fuel, but others have abandoned the pretense entirely. I have seen the growing sentiment that the entire event has become confusing. There is a searing honesty in the realization that a country cannot celebrate a grand military legacy while suffering what many perceive as a defeat on all fronts. To celebrate a victory while your key ports are burning and your husbands are being returned in boxes is a cognitive dissonance that the Russian soul is beginning to reject. This psychological fracture is perhaps most visible among the women, the mothers, and wives who have historically been the backbone of the state's resilience. The narrative that these women are stoically sacrificing their sons for the motherland is being shredded by a new, visceral anger. We are hearing voices that call out the gold-digging scum and the idiots who send their men to war for a paycheck or a hollow sense of duty. There is a profound moral indictment being leveled against those who allow their children to become occupiers. This isn't just about the loss of life, it's about the loss of honor. The accusation that these men are disgracing their families by their presence in Ukraine is a direct strike at the heart of the regime's moral justification. It suggests that the unkind truth has finally penetrated the domestic sphere, that this campaign is not a noble struggle against existential threats, but a shameful historical blunder that will be seen as a disgrace for decades to come. The hypocrisy of the ruling class is being laid bare by their own strategic failures. Putin's administration has spent decades building a cult of security, promising that Russia would never again be vulnerable to external aggression. Yet, here we are, watching a functional system decay into a dysfunctional one. In a functional system, as any realist knows, unkind truths lead to improvement. You identify the failure, you speak the truth, and you adapt. But the Kremlin has trapped itself in a cycle of kind lies. Everything is going according to plan until the moment it isn't. When you deny the reality of a burning port or a stalled front, you lose the ability to fix the underlying problem. This is how empires crumble, not necessarily through a lack of resources, but through a total collapse of the feedback loop between the leadership and the reality of the situation. As we look at the broader geopolitical consequences, we see a world that is no longer intimidated by the Russian shadow. The Chinese are watching, the Americans are recalibrating, and the global South is taking note of the limitations of Russian power. The leverage that Moscow once held over the global energy market and security architecture is being systematically dismantled by its inability to protect its own infrastructure. If the Americans are rethinking their approach toward Russia, it is not because they have suddenly found a sense of empathy for Ukraine, but because they have realized that the Russian threat is perhaps a hollow shell of what it once was. The fear that previously dictated Western caution is being replaced by a cold, transactional analysis of Russian weakness. The trend is changing, and the indicators at the front, even those admitted by the Russians themselves, suggest that the war is no longer a tool of Russian foreign policy, but a symptom of Russian internal decline. The idea that Ukraine has no cards to play in negotiations has become an absurdity. By refusing to surrender and by taking the initiative to strike back where it hurts most, Ukraine is forced to change in the very language of the conflict. The whispers of a freeze along the front lines are no longer a demand from a position of Russian strength, but a potential exit strategy for a regime that is running out of options. The threat that more advanced Western aerial bombs could push Russian forces back to their state borders is no longer a theoretical fantasy. It is a looming reality that the Kremlin must contend with. This shift from a war of conquest to a war of survival for the Russian state itself is the ultimate irony of Putin's long game. He sought to reassert Russian dominance, but instead, he has exposed the fragility of the entire post-Soviet structure. The strategic paralysis we are witnessing is the inevitable outcome of a system that has traded its capacity for self-correction for the temporary stability of a personality cult. This is the hallmark of the terminal phase of any overextended power. When the feedback loops are severed, the state begins to consume itself from within. I look at the internal logic of the functional versus dysfunctional system, and the diagnosis is clear. Russia has entered the lethal spiral of the kind lie, where each tactical failure is rebranded as a strategic success and each forced retreat is framed as a gesture of goodwill. But reality is an uncompromising auditor, and it has come to collect. The drones hitting the oil terminals at Ust-Luga and the visible collapse of domestic trust are the unkind truths that the Russian leadership is no longer equipped to process. They have spent so long convincing their population and perhaps themselves that they are the architects of a new world order that they have forgotten the fundamental requirement of any hegemon, the ability to actually protect the infrastructure of the state. This failure has profound implications for the global chessboard. For decades, the West viewed Russia as a peer competitor, a dark mirror of its own ambitions. But as the facade cracks, we see that the threat was predicated on a series of assumptions that no longer hold true in the era of high-precision drone warfare and economic vulnerability. The U.S. establishment, often criticized for its own systemic hypocrisies and overreach, is finding a strange sort of vindication not through its own brilliance, but through the sheer incompetence of its primary rival. This isn't necessarily the triumph of Western liberal democracy so much as it is the catastrophic failure of its primary antagonist to maintain the basic functions of a modern state. The Global South is watching this with a mixture of apprehension and opportunistic calculation. Countries that once looked to Moscow as a counterweight to Washington are now forced to reckon with the reality that their supposed protector cannot even secure its own fuel depots. This is how the multipolar world is actually being born, not through a grand, organized transition, but through the messy, violent decomposition of a former superpower that failed to adapt to the unkind truths of the 21st century. We must also consider the human cost of this cynicism, particularly the war of robots that the Russian intellectual class is now openly discussing. When you hear analysts in Moscow admitting that they are moving toward a conflict where people are no longer the primary factor, yet the body count continues to rise, you are seeing a regime that has fundamentally abandoned its people. The comparison to the Paraguayan War is not just a historical footnote, it is a warning of demographic annihilation. If only 10% of the male population survived those 19th century conflicts, what does it say about the current Russian leadership that they are willing to push their nation toward a similar deadlock? The meat grinder strategy is not just a tactical choice, it is a moral abdication. When a regime views its own citizens as disposable assets in a stalled game of geopolitical chess, it loses its fundamental right to lead. The mothers in the Russian heartland who are beginning to voice their disgust, calling out the gold diggers and the idiots who send their men to die for a paycheck, are the harbingers of a deeper societal rut. They are seeing the disgrace that the history books will eventually record, regardless of what the state-controlled television says today. The choices facing the world's powerful nations are now more stark than ever. Will they continue to fuel this fire in hopes of a total Russian collapse, or will they seek a way to manage the fallout of a nuclear-armed state in decline? The irony of the situation is that even figures like Donald Trump, the ultimate disruptors of the traditional world order, are being forced to adapt to this reality. His previous willingness to throw Ukraine under the bus for a deal with Putin is being overridden by the base reality of who is currently winning the battle of technical and psychological resilience. In the world of geopolitical realism, the only thing more dangerous than a powerful enemy is a failing one that still thinks it can dictate terms. The transition from the kind lie to the unkind truth is never peaceful. It is a process of friction, heat, and eventually fire. Ukraine's refusal to accept its assigned role as a victim has changed the narrative from one of inevitable Russian victory to inevitable Russian reckoning. As we watch the plumes of smoke rise from Russian ports and listen to the desperate anger of its most loyal supporters, we are seeing the end of an era. The world order that was forged in the aftermath of the Cold War is finally breaking, and what comes next is still shrouded in the fog of war. But one thing is certain: the era of the kind lie is coming to a close. History has no patience for those who refuse to see the world as it is. It favors the resilient, the adaptable, and those who have the courage to face the unkind truths of their own making. The map of the future is being drawn not in the boardrooms of the elites, but in the trenches and the burning oil fields of a conflict that has exposed the hollow core of a once feared empire. The unkind truth is that Russia is currently destroying its own future to preserve a past that no longer exists. Reflect on the cycle we've examined today. The shift from propaganda to reality is the most dangerous moment for any nation. It is the moment when the kind lies stop working and the unkind truths begin to dictate the terms of survival. Tell me what you think about this transition and the changing nature of global power in the comments below. I try to read as many as I can to understand the pulse of those who are actually paying attention. Thank you for your time, your engagement, and for being the kind of person who looks beyond the surface to understand the hidden mechanisms of power. Can a regime built on a foundation of kind lies ever truly survive the collision with unkind truths on the battlefield? When the history of this decade is written, will we see it as the birth of a new multipolar reality, or merely the chaotic decomposition of an old order that refused to evolve?